Ever wonder how people dealt with death before modern therapy? Did medieval folk just suffer in silence when they lost someone they loved? Number 8. Prayer and religious devotion. Death was everywhere in the medieval world. A simple cut could lead to infection and the grave within days. Childbirth claimed countless mothers. Children often didn't survive to adulthood. In this harsh reality, religion wasn't just a Sunday commitment, it was the primary framework for understanding and processing grief. When death struck a medieval household, prayer became the immediate refuge. Medieval people believed fervently that their prayers could directly help their deceased loved ones navigate the afterlife. The concept of purgatory, a spiritual waiting room where souls were purified before entering heaven, gave the bereaved a profound sense of ongoing connection with the dead. They could actively help their departed family members through this difficult spiritual transition by praying for them. Churches would ring their bells to announce a death in the community, calling everyone to stop and pray for the departed soul. Wealthy families might commission hundreds or even thousands of masses to be said for their deceased relatives. The poor would save what little they could to pay for at least a few memorial prayers. Many grieving individuals threw themselves into intense religious devotion following a loss. Some went on pilgrimages to holy sites, walking hundreds of miles in memory of their loved ones. These journeys served as physical expressions of grief while also earning spiritual merit that could be transferred to the deceased to ease their time in purgatory. Medieval women, particularly widows, sometimes joined religious communities after losing their husbands. These weren't always formal nunneries. Many became anchoresses, living in small cells attached to churches where they would spend their days in prayer and contemplation. Julian of Norwich, one of medieval England's most important mystical writers, became an anchoress following a severe illness where she believed she received divine revelations. For ordinary people, local saints offered comfort in times of grief. Parents who lost children would visit shrines dedicated to child saints, bringing small offerings or votive figurines. Some even brought toys that had belonged to their deceased children, creating tangible connections between the living and the dead through these sacred intermediaries. Number 7. Elaborate funeral rituals. Could complex funeral customs actually help people process grief? Medieval communities certainly thought so. When someone died in medieval times, their body wasn't whisked away to a funeral home. Instead, it remained at home, where family members washed and prepared it for burial. This intimate care of the deceased provided important closure for grieving families, allowing them to perform one final act of service for their loved one. The body would then be wrapped in a shroud, a simple cloth covering, though wealthy families might use elaborate textiles. Unlike today's private viewings, medieval bodies were often displayed publicly, with neighbors and community members coming to pay respects. This communal acknowledgement of death helped validate the family's grief. Professional mourners were sometimes hired, particularly by wealthy families. These individuals, usually women, would wail, tear their hair, and demonstrate extreme expressions of grief that might have felt inappropriate for family members to display publicly. Some historians believe these dramatic performances helped the truly bereaved process their emotions by proxy. Funeral processions turned private grief into community events. The entire village or town section might join as the body was carried to the church and then to the burial ground. Bells would toll continuously, their somber notes marking the community's loss. The sound of funeral bells was so powerful that some medieval writers described them as literally carrying the soul to heaven. After the burial came the funeral feast. Far from being somber affairs, these meals could be surprisingly lively. Attendees would eat, drink, and share stories about the deceased. For peasant families with limited resources, neighbors would contribute food and drink, demonstrating how communities rallied to support the bereaved. The rich could afford spectacular funeral displays. When Eleanor of Castile, beloved wife of England's King Edward I, died in 1290, her body was transported from Lincolnshire to London in a funeral procession that stopped at multiple locations. At each stop, Edward commissioned a stone cross to be built in her memory. These linear crosses became landmarks, with 3 still partially standing today. Perhaps most striking to modern sensibilities was the tradition of charnel houses. As cemetery space became limited, bones would be exhumed after several years and placed in ossuary chambers, often artfully arranged. Families would sometimes visit these collections of bones, maintaining a physical connection with ancestors long after death. Rather than finding this macabre, medieval people saw it as a natural continuation of their relationship with the deceased. Number 6. Memento mori and visual reminders. Would you wear jewelry featuring a tiny coffin or a skull? Medieval people did, and for good reason. Remember, you must die. This stark phrase underlies the concept of memento mori, the medieval practice of keeping visual reminders of mortality close at hand. While this might seem morbid to modern sensibilities, for medieval people, these reminders served as powerful tools for processing grief and placing individual losses within life's greater pattern. Physical reminders of death were everywhere in medieval culture. Wealthy individuals commissioned special memento mori jewelry, including rings with miniature coffins that opened to reveal tiny skeletons or pendants engraved with skulls. These weren't just fashion statements, but practical reminders that helped normalize grief through constant acknowledgement of death's inevitability. Churches and public buildings often featured artwork depicting the dance of death or dance macabre, showing people from all walks of life, kings, merchants, peasants, children, being led away by skeleton figures. These images communicated that death came to everyone regardless of status, which could be strangely comforting to those mourning a personal loss. Their grief wasn't unique, it was the universal human condition. Books of hours, devotional texts used by laypeople for daily prayers, frequently contained memento mori imagery. The owners of these books would literally hold death in their hands daily, integrating mortality into their spiritual practice. Some contained intricate miniature paintings showing corpses in various stages of decomposition, a visual meditation on the transience of life that helped contextualize individual grief. Tomb effigies served as permanent memento mori installations. Many medieval tombs featured 2 representations of the deceased, one showing them in their prime, dressed in finery and looking dignified, and below it, another showing their naked corpse being consumed by worms and insects. These trancy tombs reminded viewers of the physical reality of death while also honoring the individual who had passed. Objects called death's heads, often actual human skulls, were kept in some households as constant reminders of mortality. Rather than increasing fear or sorrow, these objects helped medieval people maintain perspective during mourning. By keeping death visible and tangible, they attempted to tame its power to overwhelm them with grief. For the grief-stricken, these constant reminders of death's universality could be profoundly comforting. One didn't feel singled out by tragedy, but rather initiated into a universal experience. This framework helped transform the sharp pain of immediate loss into a more contemplative relationship with mortality itself. Number 5. Memory and commemoration. How do you keep someone alive after they're gone? Medieval people mastered the art of remembrance. Memory wasn't just passive remembering for medieval people, it was an active practice that helped them process grief and maintain bonds with the deceased. Long before photographs captured likenesses, medieval communities developed sophisticated methods for commemorating their dead. Anniversary commemorations structured grief into manageable timeframes. The calendar became marked with days of remembrance, not just the death date, but often the 7th day, the 30th day, and yearly anniversaries thereafter. On these occasions, special prayers would be said, candles lit, and meals shared in honor of the deceased. These ritualized remembrances gave permission for grief to resurface periodically, rather than demanding immediate moving on. Libraries and books became powerful vehicles for remembrance. Monasteries maintained library memorials or memorial books, listing names of deceased community members and benefactors. Each day, monks would read aloud from these books during prayers, ensuring that the dead remained part of the community's daily experience. Wealthy individuals sometimes donated books to churches with the specific condition that their names be remembered during services. The practice of creating death masks, plaster casts taken directly from the face of the deceased, preserved the exact likeness of important individuals. These masks could then be used to create accurate portrait sculptures for tombs or public monuments. For family members, these portraits provided tangible focal points for remembrance. Food and communal meals played special roles in commemoration. Many families would prepare their deceased loved ones' favorite dishes on anniversary dates. Some communities held dole feasts where bread was distributed to the poor in memory of the dead person, combining commemoration with charity. These practices connected abstract grief with sensory experiences that made memory tangible. For those who could afford them, chantry chapels became permanent spaces of remembrance. These were special areas within churches endowed by wealthy individuals where priests would say continual masses for the donor's soul after death. Some chantries included living quarters for the priest and operated for centuries after the founder's death. The grandest example might be King's College, Cambridge, which Henry VI established partly as a massive chantry where scholars would pray for his soul in perpetuity. Even for common people, memorialization took creative forms. Clothing or personal items belonging to the deceased might be repurposed into memorial objects. A mother's dress could become altar cloths, a father's tools might be preserved and displayed. These transformations honored the dead while keeping their memory present in daily life. Number 4, professional grief management. Need help managing overwhelming sorrow? In medieval times, there were experts for that too. While they didn't have licensed therapists, medieval communities developed sophisticated systems for managing grief through professional intermediaries. These roles helped structure emotional responses to loss and provided guidance through the grieving process. Parish priests served as the frontline grief counselors of medieval society. Beyond performing funeral rites, they provided ongoing pastoral care to bereaved parishioners. Priests were trained to explain death within Christian frameworks, offering theological interpretations that could help mourners find meaning in their loss. They reminded the grieving of resurrection promises and the temporary nature of earthly separation. Monastic communities specialized in intercessory prayer for the dead, effectively professionalizing the spiritual aspects of grief management. Wealthy families might pay monasteries for perpetual prayer services, while even common folk could request more modest commemorations. These arrangements gave mourners confidence that professional prayer specialists were attending to their loved ones' spiritual needs, alleviating anxiety about the deceased's afterlife journey. Guild organizations, medieval professional associations, provided structured support systems following members' deaths. Most guilds maintained detailed protocols for attending members' funerals, supporting widows and orphans, and commemorating deceased members at annual services. Guild membership ensured that professional colleagues would step in to manage both practical and emotional aspects of bereavement. For royal and noble women, professional mourners called weepers or pleureurs performed public demonstrations of grief that might have been considered unseemly for the actual family members. These professionals wore distinctive mourning clothes and performed ritualized expressions of sorrow. Their theatrical grief served as emotional proxies, allowing family members to maintain composure while ensuring the deceased received appropriately dramatic mourning. Medical practitioners of the period, working within humoral theory, viewed excessive grief as a potential health hazard that could disrupt bodily balance. Physicians might prescribe specific diets, herbal remedies, or activities to counteract grief-induced physical symptoms. These early medical interventions acknowledged the profound physical impact of emotional distress. Legal professionals specialized in executing wills and managing inheritance disputes, removing practical burdens from the recently bereaved. Medieval will execution was taken extremely seriously, as proper distribution of the deceased's goods was considered essential for their soul's peace. Knowing these matters were being handled properly by professionals provided significant emotional relief to grieving families. Number 3, community support systems. Who helps you through your darkest days? Medieval communities had built-in support networks that modern people might envy. The highly communal nature of medieval life meant that grief was rarely experienced in isolation. From the moment death occurred, community support mechanisms activated to surround the bereaved with practical and emotional assistance. Neighbors would immediately mobilize when a death occurred. They would help prepare the body, bring food for the household, and assist with funeral arrangements. This flurry of activity meant the bereaved weren't left alone with their thoughts, but were surrounded by supportive community presence. For peasant families living on subsistence farming, neighbors would even tend the fields of the bereaved, ensuring their livelihood didn't collapse amid grief. Guilds and fraternal organizations functioned as sophisticated support networks. If a craftsman died, his guild brothers would ensure his workshop continued operating and his apprentices were properly supervised. They might temporarily fulfill his professional obligations while his family adjusted to their loss. Guild charters explicitly outline these responsibilities, institutionalizing grief support. Parish communities organized prayer vigils where neighbors would gather in the home of the deceased, praying throughout the night. These vigils served multiple purposes, providing spiritual comfort, ensuring the family wasn't alone during those difficult first nights, and creating space for communal storytelling about the deceased that helped process collective grief. Women played especially important roles in community grief support. Female neighbors and relatives would take over household management, cooking, childcare, and other domestic responsibilities while the immediate family focused on their emotional needs. These women formed informal grief counseling networks, sharing their own experiences of loss and offering practical wisdom for surviving bereavement. Communal memorial feasts brought entire neighborhoods together to honor the dead. Unlike modern funeral receptions, these weren't solemn affairs but often included music, dancing, and storytelling, celebrating the deceased's life rather than focusing solely on their death. These gatherings acknowledged grief while preventing bereaved individuals from withdrawing into isolation. For widows and orphans, particularly vulnerable in medieval society, community support was formalized through church and civic institutions. Parish poor boxes often specifically designated funds for supporting widows. Some towns maintained almshouses where widows could live while adjusting to their new circumstances. Orphaned children might be formally apprenticed to their father's colleagues or taken in by extended family with community oversight. Village and town councils sometimes reduced tax obligations for newly widowed households, acknowledging the economic impact of losing a provider. This community-based financial relief reflected an understanding that grief had both emotional and practical dimensions requiring different forms of support. Number 2, creative and literary expression. How do you transform overwhelming sorrow into something beautiful? Medieval people poured their grief into art, music, and poetry. Long before grief journaling became a therapeutic recommendation, medieval people were processing loss through creative expression. These artistic outlets provided structured ways to express emotions that might otherwise have remained painfully internalized. Poetry emerged as a particularly powerful vehicle for grief expression. Elegies, poems specifically dedicated to mourning the dead, followed established literary conventions while allowing for personal expression. When the French poet Christine de Pizan lost her husband to an epidemic in 1390, she produced some of the period's most moving poetry about widowhood and grief. Her works expressed the raw pain of loss while also demonstrating how writing itself helped her survive her sorrow. Illuminated manuscripts commemorating the deceased combined visual art with written tributes. Wealthy patrons commissioned personalized prayer books featuring portraits of their departed loved ones, creating objects that were simultaneously artistic, devotional, and commemorative. Creating these books was often a collaborative process between grieving family members and skilled artisans, with the artistic process itself serving therapeutic functions. Music provided emotional release for grieving communities. Professional composers created elaborate funeral motets and requiems, while folk traditions included laments that could be customized for individual deaths. Singing these pieces together allowed medieval mourners to express grief physically, using breath and voice in cathartic ways that research now confirms can reduce stress hormones. Architecture and monument building transformed grief into lasting public statements. When King Edward I lost his beloved wife Eleanor in 1290, he channeled his grief into creating the famous Eleanor crosses, marking each place her funeral procession rested. These elaborate stone monuments, some still standing today, transformed his private loss into public art. On more modest scales, ordinary people would carve or commission memorial stones, crosses, or church modifications to honor their dead. Textile arts became outlets for women's grief in particular. Embroidering altar cloths, creating memorial banners, or sewing burial garments allowed women to process loss through meditative handwork. Some medieval women incorporated hair from the deceased into their textile creations, physically integrating their loved one into the commemorative object. Storytelling traditions preserved memories of the deceased within community narratives. Professional storytellers might incorporate tales of locally respected individuals who had died into their repertoires. These stories, repeated at gatherings and festivals, ensured that the deceased remained present in community consciousness, their lives transformed into instructive or entertaining tales that extended their social presence beyond death. Dramatic performances occasionally incorporated grief themes, particularly in religious mystery plays that depicted biblical instances of bereavement and consolation. By watching these performances, medieval audiences gained emotional vocabulary and spiritual frameworks for understanding their own losses. Number 1. Physical expressions and embodied grief. Can your body help you grieve? Medieval people understood grief wasn't just emotional, it was physical too. Long before modern science confirmed the physical dimensions of grief, medieval people intuitively recognized that bodily practices could help process emotional pain. Their approach to bereavement involved deliberate physical expressions that modern grief counselors might actually recommend. Mourning clothes served as visual markers of grief that protected the bereaved from inappropriate social expectations. While nobility followed elaborate mourning dress protocols with specific garments for different relationships and grief stages, even peasants would modify their appearance through simple black armbands or veils. These outward signs communicated handle with care to the community while also providing the bereaved with physical reminders of their transitional state. Pilgrimage offered a literal way to walk through grief. Following the death of a loved one, many medieval people undertook journeys to holy sites, sometimes traveling hundreds of miles on foot. These physical challenges provided structure to ambiguous emotional processes, with the physical hardship of the journey mirroring and eventually relieving inner pain. The changing landscapes and encounters along pilgrim routes prevented the stagnation that can characterize grief, keeping both body and emotions in motion. Self-flagellation and other physical mortification practices, though extreme by modern standards, gave some grieving individuals embodied ways to express overwhelming emotions. By voluntarily taking on physical pain, the bereaved could externalize internal suffering, making it visible and manageable. These practices were generally time-limited and performed within religious frameworks that promised eventual consolation. Dancing emerged as a surprising grief expression in medieval communities. The infamous dancing mania outbreaks that periodically swept through European towns often followed periods of collective trauma or loss. While sometimes viewed as mass hysteria, these phenomena might also represent communal physical processing of grief too overwhelming for verbal expression. Even in less extreme forms, structured mourning dances allowed physical release of tension while maintaining social connection. Fasting and dietary modifications were common grief responses. Some mourners would abstain from favorite foods or observe special dietary restrictions for defined periods after a death. These practices acknowledged how grief affects appetite and digestion, while providing mourners with daily physical reminders of their loss that gradually eased as the designated mourning period concluded. Sleep practices adapted to accommodate grief. Medieval medical texts recommended specific sleeping arrangements for the recently bereaved, including changes to bed position, special pillows, sometimes incorporating items belonging to the deceased, and herbal sleep aids. These recommendations recognized how physical comfort could support emotional healing. Touch remained important throughout the grief process. From the initial washing and preparation of the body, tasks family members often performed themselves, to the embracing of fellow mourners, physical contact helped process grief. Some mourning rituals involved touching or kissing the corpse, crosses, or relics, creating tactile connections that made abstract loss more concrete. Has our modern approach to grief lost something valuable that medieval people understood? What ancient wisdom about processing loss might help us face our own inevitable encounters with death?